Mine's loading.
बीच ऑर्डर कर दो ना आपको तनवीर भाई अभी से ऑर्डर कर दो क्लास में
Recording in progress.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Yesterday, so alhamdulillah, today is the last day inshallah of this Dawrah. Yesterday we finished Abu Dawood, right? Sunan Abu Dawood, okay. Today inshallah we will finish the 6 books of Hadith, and with that we will finish the 3rd century, and then inshallah we will take the 4th and 5th century and mention a few of the books, but that will be very quick. I mean, most of these books we won't get into too much detail regarding them. The main objective of those other books that I will mention is just for you to be familiar with the name, because they're not used as much, but if you ever do hear them, if you hear them referenced, or if you read them referenced at the bottom of the footnotes and so on, at least you're familiar with those names. So that's the objective of that. And then maybe we will mention a few other famous books of hadith that are not considered sources of hadith. They may be later on books, but they are books which should be studied also, because there's a difference between, let's say for example, I was to write a book of hadith for people to study in a school, for example. And now if you are doing a khutbah, for example, and you read that hadith in my book, you won't reference the hadith narrated by Huzaifah in his book. You reference Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, because they're the sources, they're the foundational books. So we will mention later on some of the later books that have been written for a person to study, and which are also important. But it is important to remember that these are books that might have come later on. So after the 3rd century kind of finished, we're gonna talk about it inshallah. Then the books written after that are just works which are more books which have been based on the previous books, and just maybe more, it's basically more work on the previous books. Maybe you are summarizing or adding or taking away or authenticating or something like that. And then after that, inshallah, we will take some of the doubts regarding those who reject hadith. Either they reject hadith totally or partially. And then right at the end, we will talk a bit about the Orientalists, but that'll be very short, inshallah. So we'll continue. We're talking about Imam al-Tirmidhi. And like we mentioned, in terms of the biography of the actual authors, initially my plan was to mention them, but because of time we won't. But they are, I'm pretty sure you can find their biographies online, inshallah, and in the books as well. And I'm pretty sure if you actually buy the books themselves, if you look at the beginning of each book, maybe the publisher of the book might have mentioned a brief biography of each of the authors. So if you were to buy Tirmidhi, for example, I'm pretty sure most of the time in the beginning of the book, the publisher or the translator, whoever it may be, they probably have added a small biography of the Imam as extra benefit. So if you want to add that to your notes here, then I recommend you to read those as well. So we move on to Imam al-Tirmidhi, or Sunan al-Tirmidhi. Sunan al-Tirmidhi, anyone remind me what does Sunan mean? Sunan? Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan is a book which is ordered upon the chapters of fiqh. However, with al-Tirmidhi, even though generally it's called Sunan al-Tirmidhi, because the books which are mentioned next to it are all called Sunan. Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan al-Nisa'i, Sunan Ibn Majah. However, the ulama, what they mention is that a more precise name of Sunan al-Tirmidhi is to call it Al-Jami' al-Tirmidhi, or Jami' al-Tirmidhi. They say it's more precise to call it Jami'. And who remembers what a Jami' means? Eight chapters or 8 topics. And we mentioned those topics, so we can go back to those topics when we talked about Al-Jami' in the name Al-Jami' al-Sahih by Imam al-Bukhari. The point being is that, so At-Tirmidhi is not just a fiqh book, but it has the other topics that we talked about yesterday also. Now, if you remember, I mentioned a statement of Imam Bukhari, Imam Ahmad, that he said to Abu Dawood, I have benefited more from you than you have from me. There's also Imam al-Bukhari, he said that to Imam al-Tirmidhi. Imam Bukhari also said that to Imam al-Tirmidhi. No. As for the one with Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawood, that might have been a mistake from me. I'll have to double check. Okay? So the one which I know, which is correct, is Imam Bukhari said it to Imam al-Tirmidhi. As for Imam Ahmad to Abu Dawood, that's something I will have to double check later on for you, inshallah. Yesterday Imam Ahmad to Abu Dawood. Ahmad to Abu Dawood. Abu Dawood was his student. We mentioned Abu Dawood showed his book to Imam Ahmad a number of times and he agreed with it. But as for that exact statement, that's something I will have to double check, inshallah. So, Jami' Tirmidhi, when we talk about his methodology, the first point that we can mention is that it's a Jami' and it's not just a sunan, meaning it has all 8 types. The second is that it's narrated, it's ordered in chapters, as all of the other books are after the 1st century. And then also, after he mentions the hadith, he would give indications to other hadith which are also narrated in that chapter. So and I'll give an example. So the next methodological point is that after narrating the hadith, he would mention or he would indicate to other ahadith which have been narrated regarding that chapter. He would indicate to other ahadith which have been narrated in that chapter. Basically what this means is that he would narrate a hadith, and after talking about the hadith, he would also say وَفِي الْبَابِ عن عمر وأبي هريرة and so on. He would say, and in this chapter there's a hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah and Umar and so on. So he wouldn't mention the whole hadith. Okay, because remember, even with the other books, we mentioned that these scholars, they had hundreds of thousands of hadith and they picked certain hadith to place in their books. So likewise, Imam Tirmidhi chose certain hadith to place in his books, but just for extra benefit, he would mention in this chapter there's also a hadith narrated by this Sahabi and this Sahabi. Meaning, if somebody wanted more information, then he indicated towards, which hadith to look at. So that's something that he used to, that he would do. Another thing that he would do is that he would also after mentioning the hadith, he would give the authenticity of the hadith. So he would mention هذا حديث صحيح or Hasan, and he had a particular word or terminology that was khas, which is specific to him. Meaning other muhaddithun wouldn't use this terminology, which is Hasanun Sahih. You would say, we have normally a hadith is either Sahih, authentic, Hasan, good, or Da'if, weak. He has something called Hasanun Sahih, Hasan and Sahih. That's something that Imam At-Tirmidhi had. And he also sometimes will call a hadith Gharib. And sometimes Hasanun Gharib. These are all unique to him. Especially Hasan Sahih, he used that one a lot.
What's the last one?
Hasan Gharib.
Hasan Sahih.
Oh, Hasan Sahih, Gharib, Hasan Gharib. Basically, a lot of these different combinations. Okay, but the main one is Hasan Sahih. Now, somebody may ask that what does Hasan Sahih actually mean? What does Hasan Sahih? If Imam At-Tirmidhi says, وَهَذَا حَدِيثٌ حَسَنٌ صَحِيح, either it's Sahih or either it is a Hasan. How is he saying Hasan Da'if? Now, there's an issue with this, which is that he didn't explain he died before he explained what he meant. So he passed away and he didn't explain what he meant. So now the scholars are trying to work out. So what they are doing is that all those ahadith where he said Hasan Sahih, they would gather all of them and they would look, okay, what does he mean by this? And the ulama differ in this a lot. Ibn Kathir has his own interpretation, Ibn Salah has his own interpretation. But I'll mention one. maybe if you study Mustalah al-Hadith, because this is normally studied the Mustalah al-Hadith under the chapter of Hasan, maybe we can go into more detail there, but I'll just give you one opinion for now, which is the opinion of Ibn Hajar. Ibn Hajar says, if that hadith only has one chain of narration, then what he means by Hasan and Sahih, that either it is Hasan or Sahih, one of the two. It could be Hasan or it could be Sahih. He's not sure which one. Okay? So if there's one chain, so if you got hadith, there's only one chain of narration, then it is either Hasan or Sahih. He's not sure, and that isn't really a big issue, because even if the hadith goes to the level of Hasan, it's still accepted. It's still something which is accepted. And then Ibn Hajar says, if the hadith has two narrations, if the hadith has two chains of narration, so this hadith has been narrated through one sheikh, one chain of narration, and also a different sheikh narrated it from his own different chain of narration. If that is the case, then one is Sahih and the other is Hasan. One chain is Sahih and the other chain is considered, other chain is Hasan. That's the opinion of Ibn Hajar. And if as for Hasan, as for Gharib, if Imam Tirmidhi says Gharib, then those who might have studied Mustalah Hadith, anyone know what Gharib means in Mustalah Hadith? That's the translation. What the technical definition? Anyone know? He got it. So in Gharib is where in Mustalah Hadith, where in one of the levels there's only one narrator who's heard that. That's called Gharib. Meaning, if from the Sahaba, 20 different Sahaba heard this hadith from Rasulullah, and then 50 of the Tabi'een heard it. But then from the Tabi'een, there's only one person who heard it, or one person that's narrated it, that is reached us. Okay, and then maybe the level after it, there's 50 again. If in one of those levels there's one person, that's called Gharib. Meaning, if the minimum number in one of the levels, that's called Gharib. That's what's famously known in Mustalah al-Hadith. Okay? And I mention this because this, if you study it, it's quite well known for those who have studied Mustalah Hadith, that is the definition of Gharib. However, when Imam al-Tirmidhi uses the word Gharib, he doesn't mean that. When Imam al-Tirmidhi uses the word Gharib, he doesn't mean that. When he uses it, it means that it's weak. He means da'if. He means weak. And there's a difference. If one person's narrated it, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily weak. It could be authentic. The hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, Umar is the only Sahabi who narrated it. And the Tabi'i who heard it was the only Tabi'i. And the Tabi'i was the only person who heard it. And then after that, there was, I think, 500 people who heard it after that. And that's the first hadith in Sahih Bukhari. Okay, so just the number of people in a chain of narration doesn't affect the authenticity. But what affects the authenticity is the conditions that the ulama have mentioned, which are studied in the science of Mustalah al-Hadith. But anyways, so Hasan and Sahih means Ibn Hajar, one chain of narration, either Hasan or Sahih. Two chains of narration, one is Hasan and the other is Sahih. Imam al-Tirmidhi would also mention the different mazahib of the ulama regarding those ahadith. So he would basically mention basically going to fiqh a little bit. So if you mention a hadith, he would mention, okay, and this is the opinion of the majority of the ulama from Medina, from Mecca, and so on. So he would talk a bit about the fiqh understanding of the hadith, the opinions and the different mazahib of especially the Sahaba and Tabi'een and the famous Imams. And that's why you'll find sometimes he also mention some of the sayings of the Sahaba. Sometimes he would also mention some of the sayings of the Sahaba. Okay, and I'm going to mention two explanations.
What does Tirmidhi mean by
Weak. Bias. Hasan, I don't remember at the moment, so I don't want to mention it. No. But Hasan Gharib, I think what he means is Hasan and Gharib, he means the Mustalah Hadith meaning of Gharib, meaning that one person in the chain. Maybe, but I'm not 100% sure, that's why I didn't mention it. Normally, all of these, if you look at in the science of Mustalah Hadith, on the chapter of Hasan, they talk about it. Because Imam Tirmidhi uses the word Hasan, especially Hasan Sahih a lot. So they talk about the terminologies of Imam Tirmidhi now. Okay, one explanation, I'll just mention one. It's called Tuhfatu al-Ahwadi. Tuhfatu al-Ahwadi. Tuhfatu al-Ahwadi. Ahwadi. Tuhfatu al-Ahwadi. And this is by Abdul Rahman ibn Abdul Rahim. Abdul Rahman ibn Abdul Rahim al-Mubarak Furi. Al-Mubarak Furi. He passed away about 90 years ago. Abdul Rahman ibn Abdul Rahim al-Mubarak Furi. Okay, then the next book is Sunan al-Nisa'i. Sunan al-Nisa'i, in terms of his methodology, then again, firstly, it's a sunan, meaning it follows the chapters of fiqh. It follows the chapters of fiqh. And just for extra benefit, the chapters of fiqh, or the books of fiqh generally, and you can extend this ruling to the words, to the books, which are called sunan. The books of fiqh are generally split into 4 parts. The books of fiqh are generally split into 4 parts. The first is ibadat, worship, meaning all the 5 pillars of Islam apart from the first, apart from the La ilaha illallah or the Shahada, because that's aqidah. But in terms of salah, you start with tahara, wudu and everything, because you need that for salah, and then salah, and then zakah, and then fasting, and then hajj. That's the first part. Then the second is normally buying and selling, transactions. So then they talk about the rulings of buying and selling, what's halal, what's haram, and so on. Well, what is considered riba, what's not considered riba, and so on. And then the third is ahkam al-usra, family law. Nikah, talaq, everything to do with that. And then the fourth is al-jinayat, which is criminal law. Criminal law. Okay, so the books of fiqh are split like this. Okay, so generally sunan, because they are even though the books of hadith, but sunan is what is ordered upon the chapters of fiqh. So you'll find the sunan are ordered in the same way. So for example, if I wanted to find, let's say we had a book which is 4 volumes, and each volume was one of these topics. If I wanted to find hadith regarding nikah, which volume would I go to? The 3rd volume. If I wanted to find a hadith regarding Ramadan's coming, I want to talk about fasting. 1st volume, chapter of fasting. Okay? Alhamdulillah. Right. Imam al-Nasa'i, another thing that he did is that he was very careful who he narrated from. Meaning that it wasn't necessarily a condition of his book that everything had to be authentic, like Sahih Bukhari or Muslim, but he was very more careful than maybe Sunan Abi Dawud or Nisa'i or Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, from who he took that hadith from. So he was more stricter than the other Sunan. Okay, so not everything was Sahih. There are a few which are lower than the level of Sahih, but he was more vigilant and more stricter compared to the other Sunan. Also, another thing that he did was that, linking to this, is that if the hadith was weak, he would mention it. If a hadith was weak, he would mention it and he would explain it. If a hadith was weak, he would mention it.
He mentioned all the rulings that he had, or only when it was weak?
No, only when he was weak. Or mainly when he was weak. Then he would explain and clarify the weakness in hadith. And this point, we also mentioned this point for Abu Dawud. And Abu Dawud, he actually, in his letter to the people of Makkah, he actually wrote, he said, whatever I remain silent, فَهُوَ صَالِح. Meaning, that means it is good. Meaning, it's either Sahih or Hasan. You can use it for fiqh rulings. Accepted, it's accepted. So, you could say maybe that Imam Nasa'i, maybe he didn't say it clearly like this, but generally, If he stayed silent, it's because he considered it to be accepted. And then he only talked about those hadith which were weak. Okay, move on to the next book, Ibn Majah. An-Nasa'i has there's some it's not a full explanation, but there's some footnotes, like just some few footnotes. There's two. There's one by Imam al-Suyuti, and there's one by Abu al-Hasan Muhammad ibn Abdul Hadi al-Sindi. Abu al-Hasan Muhammad ibn Abdul Hadi al-Sindi. First Imam al-Suyuti, the second is Abu al-Hasan Muhammad ibn Abdul Hadi al-Sindi. And they're both famously known as Hashiyah. Hashiyah means footnotes in Arabic. So Hashiyah to Suyuti and Hashiyah to al-Sindi. It's not the difference between sharh, explanation, and Hashiyah, footnote, is that sharh is like proper explanation. And footnotes is just every now and again, anything which is a bit difficult, just talk about that and move on. Just,
And the same book is there, but
yeah, it's like, when you go, when you look at a book, and normally in the footnotes is normally just references, right? So that's similar. It's similar to that, like there's not that much writing. Bit of explanation here and the where it's required, and so on. As for like a detailed explanation, explain every single word, and then go into fiqh issues of every single issue, then they don't do that. Okay, Sunan Ibn Majah. His book, the methodology is that, again, firstly it's a sunnah, again, so it follows the same pattern as the others. The second is that he has a very important introduction in the beginning. So again, remember we said about Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim also had an introduction. Normally books at that time, and especially before that century, didn't have introductions. So Ibn Majah was somebody who had an introduction, and his introduction is very important. But sticking to the Sunnah and clinging on to the Sunnah is a very important introduction to study. He doesn't repeat. Another thing is that he does not repeat hadith. So you'll find Imam Bukhari and others, whenever it was appropriate, they would bring the hadith again. They would repeat the hadith. But Imam Ibn Majah did not do that. And he would also sometimes comment on a hadith as well. He would also sometimes comment on a hadith. And just one point regarding this that we should mention is that he had a lot of authentic, sahih / hasan, good hadith which are not found in the other sunan. Okay? So he had a lot of sahih hadith and hasan hadith which are not found in the other sunan. But at the same time, he does have a lot of hadith in there which are more weak than the other sunan. Meaning that compared to all the sunan, he had the most weak hadith in there. From the four sunan, he had the most weak hadith in there.
And he mentioned that these are weak, or it was later found out that they are weak?
I later found out that they were weak. But what's happened here?
Recording in progress.
Okay, now we can move on to day 5, alhamdulillah. Right, day 5. Firstly, there's the topics to be covered. As I mentioned, introduction to the 4th and 5th century, books in the 4th century and onwards, mustakhrajat and its benefits, books in the 5th century and 6th century onwards, doubts and answers on hadith, sunnah, Quraniyun, khabar ahad, and orientalists. These are some of the things that we will take today, inshallah. Firstly, the 4th and 5th century, some important points regarding them. 2 main points is that firstly, once the 3rd century finished, then everything regarding hadith was written. So everything regarding hadith was written and documented. And anything new, like a new hadith which hadn't been written at all, majority of the time, if not all, was either weak or fabricated. It was either weak or fabricated.
Everything.
Almost everything.
The Sahih Hadith was very less, which was already gathered.
Yeah, the all are Sahih al-Ghali. You can maybe say 99%. You can say it like that.
This is the second.
Yeah. This is the first point. Okay. Yeah, weak or fabricated. Now, the statement of Abu Bakr al-Bayhaqi is a little bit long. He says those ahadith. So statement of Abu Bakr al-Bayhaqi. He says those ahadith which are between Sahih, authentic, and Hasan, good, have been written in the books which have been compiled by the Imams of Hadith. And it is not permissible for any other hadith to not be in these books. And it is not permissible for any other hadith to not be in these books. So whoever comes with a hadith which is not from those books, it is not accepted from him. So whoever comes with a hadith which is not from those books, it is not accepted from him. Now, and then he continues, but we'll stop here, inshallah. Okay, the second point which I want to mention is that the books of Mustalah al-Hadith started to be written. The books of Mustalah al-Hadith, I think what that is, they started to be written in this century. The books of Mustalah al-Hadith began to be written in this century.
Recording in progress.
The reason, Sheikh?
1 second. I don't know, something, my internet is weak, it keeps disconnecting.
Yeah, I got someone message on YouTube.
Yeah?
I think that one
Want to connect to my internet?
It's okay. Anyone who's on Zoom and it's not clear, then you can just go to YouTube and watch it there. Okay.
both YouTube also.
Or the both. I mean, on Zoom, I'm screen sharing the worksheet as well. I think that's the benefit of Zoom. Anyways. Now, Mustalah al-Hadith, I've mentioned this quite a few times during the Dawrah. I said I studied in the science of Mustalah al-Hadith. Okay? Mustalah basically translates to terminologies. And Hadith is Hadith. Okay? And Mustalah al-Hadith it basically, without getting too technical, it studies all of the different terminologies that are used in the science of Hadith. So you study what's the meaning of a Sahih, authentic Hadith. and what are the conditions, and everything to do with it. So you don't study the hadith itself, but everything to do with sahih. When is the sahih? What are the conditions? Are there anything different upon? Which are the books of sahih, and so on. And then same with hasan, and then same with da'if. And then you go into what are the different types of da'if, and what are different levels of da'if, and so on. Okay, there's also hadith qudsi, learn about that, marfu', mawquf. So all of these terminologies which are used, munkar, munqati', mu'dal, maqtu', all of these wordings, you study in the science of mustalah al-hadith. Okay. Anyone know who's the first one to write a book in mustalah al-hadith? No, not this one, not this one. No, Bikuni was a lot later.
In the center?
Sorry? What I mean is a full book just on Mustalah al-Hadith. The thing is, Khatib Baghdadi, when did he pass away? 463. So is that 4th century or is that 5th century? Whenever it's 400 and, that's it, 5th century. Because somebody passed away 20 years after Hijrah. Is that 0th century or 1st century? 1st century, okay? So 400 and makes it 5th. So he was in 5th. So there's somebody in 4th already done. His name, I'll just give you the main name that he's known by. Ar-Ra Hurmuzi. That's why I said one name. Ar-Ra Hurmuzi. Ar-Ra Hurmuzi. That's one word. Ar-Ra Hurmuzi. One name. That's his last name. That's what he's known by. Ar-Ra Mahur.
This is the person of the book.
This is the name. This is the name of the person.
He was the first to write this.
First person to write a book in Mustalah. I'll mention the name of the book in a second. Ar-Ra Hurmuzi. He passed away in the year 360. 360. And the name of his book was Al-Muhaddith. Al-Muhaddith Al-Fasil. Al-Fasil. الصاد فاصل الصاد بين الراوي والواعي المحدث الفاصل بين الراوي والواعي. Okay, so that was the first book written on Mustalah Hadith. Maybe one of the reasons for this is because the Tamam Muhaddithin, when it came to using these terminologies, the Muhaddithun, many of them, just like any specialist in a science, they would, know these terminologies. And so maybe the best example for this, and this example is for the science, but it's generally used for each science, Arabic language or Arabic grammar. Now, did the Sahaba know Arabic grammar? The answer is, of course. So they spoke it naturally. But did they study it like we study it now? No. There was no books. But obviously when non-Arabs started to enter into the religion and so on, and they were making mistakes, then later on the ulama had to write down books for that. So likewise, when the ulama, muhaddithun, they were using all of these terminologies and so on, and these rulings. So then now, when it came to this century, the ulama saw that, okay, now we need to gather all of these different terminologies and talk about them and explain them to the people. So that's why this science was written. And that's like a general answer for all of the sciences. Even writing hadith, writing hadith. At the beginning, majority of people had memorized. Once memorization became weaker, hadith was spreading a lot more, then there was a need. So then Imam Bukhari wrote his book, and the Sahaba wrote in the scrolls, and so on. Okay, some of the books in the 4th century. The first book is on the next page now, 37. Okay. No, these are not books of Mustalah. These are books of Hadith. Okay. That point number 2 was just extra benefit regarding the century, that there's mustalah al-hadith. The science of hadith has many, we say hadith, within there are many sciences. Okay, there are many sciences.
Recording in progress.
Okay. Okay. These books, I'm going to go through them a lot quicker. The main thing is that you understand the names of the book and you recognize the names. So the first we have Sahih Ibn Khuzaymah. Sahih Ibn Khuzaymah, and as you can tell by the title, it's a book where he's compiled authentic hadith. It's a book that he's compiled authentic hadith from the word Sahih. Sorry? Well, I'm going to get to that in a second. The second book is Sahih Ibn Hibban. Sahih Ibn Hibban. Okay? So again, it's a book which has authentic hadith, and the author is Ibn Hibban. And then we have a third book which is known as Mustadrak al-Hakim. Mustadrak al-Hakim. Mustadrak is a new word now. That's a new word. What is a Mustadrak? A Mustadrak is where, in Arabic they say you do istidrak on something. It's where, so what he's done is that he has looked at Bukhari and Muslim, and he's looked at the conditions of Bukhari and Muslim, the conditions, and all of those ahadith that he has seen to be the conditions of Bukhari and Muslim apply to, but are not mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, he's gathered them in this book. All of those ahadith that fulfill the criteria and the conditions of Bukhari and Muslim, but Bukhari and Muslim do not mention them in their book. Then he compiled all of them in this book called Mustadrak al-Hakim. Because like we said, Bukhari and Muslim, in the full name, al-Mukhtasar was one of those words. Meaning summary, meaning they didn't compile every single hadith which is authentic. So there were hadith that they missed. Maybe they left out on purpose, for whatever reason it may be. Or maybe they just, didn't know that hadith, or, it could be many different reasons. So Imam Hakim came along and he said, this hadith is not in Bukhari or Muslim, but it fulfills the criteria, it fulfills their conditions. So he got all of those hadiths that fulfill those conditions and he placed it in this book, which is known as Al-Mustadrak al-Hakim.
It doesn't have single hadith which is there in Bukhari and Muslim.
Yeah, it doesn't have a hadith which is already in Bukhari and Muslim. That's the idea behind the book. But I'm going to get to it in a second, inshallah. So we talked about this yesterday. For a hadith to be authentic, there are 5 conditions. We're not going to talk about what those conditions are. That's a mustalah al-hadith. That's a different topic, okay? But normally for a hadith to be authentic, there are 5. But Bukhari and Muslim added extra conditions. They were even more strict. Okay? So let's say the conditions equal 8 or 9 in total. Any hadith which fulfilled all of these 8, 9 conditions, I'm not sure exactly how many there were, just a random number just so you understand. Any hadith that fulfilled all of them, he placed it in this book. Okay? Right. These 3 books that I mentioned, even though they are all called Sahih, and even Mustadrak al-Hakim, the idea behind it is to gather Sahih hadith, not every single hadith in there is authentic. And which is the most authentic from them is the same order that I've mentioned it for you. So the most authentic for them is Sahih Ibn Khuzaymah, meaning the weak hadith which are actually in there are very little. And Sahih Ibn Hibban, a bit more, and Al-Hakim, a little bit more than Ibn Hibban. So even though the authors have called it Sahih, maybe it was according to them, but when the ulama looked at it, then it wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. And especially when it comes to Mustadrak of Imam Hakim, the last one, because he's considered the most lenient when it came to authenticating. Okay, meaning he would authenticate a hadith which isn't authentic. Okay, many ulama actually defend him. Many of the ulama defend him. And they say the reason for this is because at the time of when he wrote this book, he was very old in age. He was very, very old in age. I don't know the age, but they say that he was very old. And when you get older, especially at a certain age, maybe your memory becomes weaker. And also he didn't have time to recheck the book. Sometimes you write a book, even me, even though I said to you, I remember I mentioned to you the other day, I've started writing some more articles. Even now, when I go back to it, every time I read it, I should change this, I should take this out, add this in. So imagine a big hadith. So he didn't have time to recheck it. But when you look at when he was in his prime age, at his prime age, then he was one of the most knowledgeable of hadith, scholars of hadith, and he didn't contradict himself, or he didn't really make mistakes when he was in his prime. But when he wrote this book in the end of his life, then that's why he made quite a few mistakes in this book. And that's why sometimes he would actually mention a hadith which is in Bukhari and Muslim, and he would mention, even though the objective was not to, it was mentioned those are hadith not in Bukhari and Muslim. But because of forgetfulness, so obviously, back in those days, it wasn't a quick Google search, let me put this word and check if it is in Bukhari or not. You have to read the whole book. You have to read all 5,000 hadith, however many hadith there are for you to check. So, mistakes were made. So whenever the ulama, and also another point to mention is that whenever the ulama say that this is weak, or they do criticize, then they don't criticize the imam. They criticize the particular book. So the difference between criticizing the imam, no one takes away from his high status, but just from the book, because maybe he was old in age, mistakes happen. Okay, even me when I'm talking, sometimes, I think once or twice, mashallah, brother corrected me, the slip of the tongue, you end up saying the wrong word by accident. Likewise, that could have happened whilst he was. When you type now, most people now probably don't know how to spell because you have autocorrect. You have, or you have shortcuts now. Even salam, you put 2 letters and the whole thing comes. Okay? Obviously, that wasn't there at that time. Okay, we have fourth book, Sharh Mushkil al-Athar. And then we have the book number 5, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar. Both of these are written by Imam al-Tahawi. Imam al-Tahawi. The first one, Mushkil al-Athar, is regarding those books which, those ahadith which seem to contradict one another. So outwardly it looks like they're contradicting. Okay, so he would bring them together and discuss them. Those ahadith which apparently looks like they may be contradicting. And so it's very important to know that there's nothing in the religion where the reality is that it's contradicting. It sometimes may seem like it, so you need an explanation to it, and that's where usul al-fiqh comes in, and we'll talk about usul al-fiqh inshallah tomorrow inshallah. Yeah. As for the fifth one, Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, then those are hadith focus more on the Hanafi madhab. Number 6, Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir by At-Tabarani. Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir At-Tabarani is a big hadith book by Imam At-Tabarani. And it's actually similar to a Musnad. It's actually similar to a Musnad, meaning it's ordered upon the names of the Sahaba. However, the reason it's not called a Musnad and it's called a Mu'jam is because he himself called it Mu'jam. So he named his book Mu'jam, so that's why the ulama stick to that name. Obviously, the author has the right to call his book whatever he wants. Nobody else has the right to call somebody else's book by a different name, except for the author himself. So he's called the Mu'jam, so the ulama. No, not really. No, not really. I mean, there's a particular order to his book, but as for a Mu'jam, generally, not really.
Even after finding there was a weak hadith in many of the books, they did not change the title of the books.
No, the books are still the same.
Titles remain the same.
They remain the same. Yeah, they remain the same. That's why Bukhari and Muslim have such a high status, because everything is authentic in there. As for the other books, then, Sahih al-Khadim, majority is authentic. This is why it's important to know some of the other books. So, for example, Al-Hakim, Mustadrak al-Hakim, if you were to buy that book in Arabic, it's very important to buy that print which has the comments of Imam al-Zahabi. Imam al-Zahabi, he looked at Mustadrak al-Hakim and he would go through those ahadith. And that which he agreed is authentic, he mentioned that he agrees. And that which he differs and say that no, this is not actually authentic, he would comment on it and he would mention that. So the book remains the same, okay, and we don't have the right to change the book. the author's written that book, of course we leave it like that. But ulama have commented on the book, so that okay, the author said this, and this isn't the most correct, and so on. That's why it's very important to go to sometimes in those other books, apart from Bukhari and Muslim, the Sunan, when you talk about the different explanations that we mentioned, those ulama who are talking about those explanations, they would mention if the hadith is weak, they would mention and they would talk about it in the explanation, and so on. That's why if a book doesn't fit its purpose, or the title doesn't really fit, you don't really have the right to change the title, because that's the right of the author. But you do have the right to comment and write your own explanation and so on. Okay, number 7 is Kitab al-Sunan by Ad-Daraqutni. Okay. And then we have number 8, we have Sunan al-Kubra by Imam al-Bayhaqi. So number 7 is by Daraqutni. And number 8 is Sunan al-Kubra by Imam al-Bayhaqi. Imam al-Bayhaqi, that's number 8. Right, we're going to... No. Okay, we're going to go through this a bit quicker now because of time. Okay, then we have something called Mustakhrajat. Now in terms of Mustakhrajat, I've not mentioned any names of any books, but I want to mention what is the meaning of Mustakhrajat, because there are some books called Mustakhrajat. Mustakhrajat is where you take a book of hadith, and you look at the same ahadith in those books, but then you narrate those same ahadith with different chains of narration. You narrate those same ahadith with different chains of narration. So mustakhraj is it's a book based upon another book. You use those same ahadith, but you mention those ahadith with different chains of narration. So, for example, if I was to do a mustakhraj upon Sahih Bukhari, I would take the first hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Okay, that's a gharib, so when you have one, Sahabi narrating and so on. But for argument's sake, just so you understand, what I would do, let's say there were Imam Bukhari mentioned one chain of narration. Let's say it was narrated by Umar. But then there's also another chain narrated by Abu Hurairah and another chain narrated by Ibn Umar, for example, right? Or if the Sahabi is the same, maybe the people in the chain, the other people are different. Okay, so you mentioned all of those different chains. Somebody may ask, why would somebody do that? So that's why we've got here benefits of the mustakhrajat. What are some of the benefits of the mustakhrajat? Why? What's the point of doing this? The first is that when you mention these different chains, okay, the first is that you learn different chains. That's obviously the first one. The first is that you expand your knowledge and you know different chains. First is that you learn different chains. The second is that it helps you in giving a ruling on the hadith. It helps you to give a ruling on the hadith. So for example, let's say one hadith is narrated from 2 chains. In the first chain, and one of the people in that chain, he's a liar. If that was the only chain that you had, you would say that the hadith is weak. But now because you've got another chain as well, you realize, the other chain is fully authentic. And then obviously your ruling of that hadith now changes. And the third benefit is that also sometimes with the different chains, there may be slight variations in the wording. One word might be different, one letter might be different. I'll give you an example in Arabic, okay? And this, subhanAllah, shows the importance of studying the Islamic sciences in the Arabic language and not in the English language, okay? And I won't use a hadith, I'll just give you a normal example of a small sentence that we would use in Arabic, okay? 3 letters, 3 huruf. We have waw, wa, and then we have fa, and then we have the word thumma, okay? If I say dakhala means to enter. If I say dakhala aliyun wa muhammadun, all that means, so means wa, okay? Muhammad and Ali entered. Right, who came first? You don't know. All it means that both of them entered. Who came first? We don't know. دخل محمد وعلي. Muhammad and Ali. Okay. If I say دخل دخل محمد فعلي, what that means is Muhammad entered فعلي, and straight after him Ali. Straight after. Okay. So it's not just after, it's straight after. Like they both came together, but only one person fit in the door one time. So Muhammad came first, Ali came after. Okay. If I said دخل علي ثم دخل محمد ثم علي, that means دخل محمد, Muhammad came first, and then Ali, I mean after some time. So you see how just wa, fa, and thumma, see how it made a difference? And this obviously, if this is a fiqh ruling, this could have an effect on when to do certain actions and so on. Okay? So likewise, when you have these different narrations, sometimes you might have find that there's a slight difference in variation in wording. Okay, so you can take benefits from that. You can take the benefits from that. And sometimes these slight variations, maybe in one hadith, the word is ambiguous, meaning you don't really fully understand what it means. But then the other hadith, because it's used a slightly different word, it makes a lot more sense, and this hadith explains the other hadith. So these are some of the another benefit of the mustakhrajat. Another benefit is you find out ambiguous names. You can find out ambiguous names. Ambiguous basically means unclear, unknown, and so on. Yeah. So, for example, let's say one chain of narration, one of the narrators is Sufyan. So he says An Sufyan, and the next person. Right? Who's this Sufyan? He just says Sufyan. Then one of the two main muhaddithin, Sufyan al-Thawri and Sufyan ibn Uyayna. Right? Which one? Maybe in a different chain, that narrator mentioned the whole name. He says Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So you know, okay, the chain is Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So you learn these ambiguous names. And the last benefit I will mention for today, the last benefit, I think it's number 5, but it's the last one, inshallah. But it's the last one, is that this is also a refutation of those who attack Bukhari. This can be used as a refutation for those who attack Imam al-Bukhari. Because it shows that Imam Bukhari is not alone in the narration of his hadith, and it also allows people double check, and it shows that these hadith are all authentic. Okay, and people generally, they don't really attack the other books of hadith; they attack Bukhari, because if you can attack Bukhari, and if they succeed, then obviously the other hadith books are less in rank. That's easier. Okay, likewise, from the people they like to attack Imam al-Shafi'i, because Imam al-Shafi'i, he was from the heaven, especially when it came to usul al-fiqh. We mentioned the book al-Risala, which we'll talk about in more depth. They like to attack basically Imam al-Shafi'i, because if they can attack him, then the other imams are a bit more easier, because they're less in rank generally than Imam al-Shafi'i, and so on. So one of the benefits of mustakhrajat is that it can be used as a refutation against those who attack Bukhari, and also the other books as well. Also the other books, but like I said, people attack Bukhari more than others. Okay, now we move on to the 5th and 6th century. Actually, shall we take a break? We'll take a 5-minute break here, inshallah. Take a 5-minute break, and then we will continue and finish, inshallah.
Recording stopped.
So how we mention this stuff, that help us to validate a particular the method of
So you take the first hadith, and then the scholars who write the Mustaqbal, all those other things that he knows, mention all of them. Then move on to the second.
So can we does this also help us
Sheikh, before you start, I need one question. Imam Zafar Sadiq, they have thousands of hadith. What do you consider this?
Who?
Imam Zafar Sadiq.
Yeah, very sorry. At the end, inshallah, it's a different topic.
At the time.
Right, we'll start.
Bashir, okay?
Yes.
Talk. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Just got last part on this 5th and 6th century, and then after that we're going to move on to the last part of the Torah. Now 5th and 6th century onwards, as you can see from the Mustakhrajat and Mustadrakat and so on, they're just working on the previous books. All they are doing is that they are working upon the previous books. And that's what scholars do, write new books. Okay, why do people still make new books? Why do people still author new books? The knowledge is there, but it's just to gather everything together to make it easier to understand and so on. So now you can see, for example, we have books on Kutub al-Sitta. So there's 6 main books of Hadith. Now you have books which have they've come and they've tried to compile all of those Hadith in one book. So I'm going to mention 2 books that have done that. So in this century, 2 books that have come and they've tried to compile all of those ahadith which are in the 6 books of hadith into one book. So instead of you going to 6 different books, that's only one. Okay? And they have their own methodology in doing so, but we're not going to go into that at the moment. The first is Jami' al-Usul. Jami' al-Usul. And when he says Jami' here, he doesn't mean the Jami' what we mentioned before. No. What he means here is the linguistic meaning, which means to Jama', to compile everything, because he's compiling all of the ahadith. Jami' al-Usul fi ahadith al-Rasul. Fi ahadith al-Rasul. So basically, it would translate to something along the lines of compiling all of the foundations regarding the ahadith of the Prophet, i.e. the foundation of hadith which are found in the 6 books of hadith. And this is by somebody called Ibn al-Athir. Jami' al-Usul fi Ahadith al-Rasul by Ibn al-Athir. And he passed away 606. 606. Ibn al-Athir. Athir. And the second book is Sharh al-Sunnah by Imam al-Baghawi. Sharh al-Sunnah by Imam al-Baghawi. And he passed away 516. 516.
All of them together without any change?
They had their own methodology in doing so. Which we don't want to go into, so they had their own ways of doing it. The main thing is that they compile. Okay, next we have Kutub al-Atraf. Kutub al-Atraf, the word Taraf basically in Arabic means like the side of something. So Taraf of this desk could be, this on the side. So what this Taraf al-Atraf will basically do is that they will just mention the first part of the hadith, of the text, and that's it. They wouldn't mention the whole hadith. And this is more, and the reason they will do this is for 2, is so that they can focus more on the chains of narration, so not the text, more on the chains. And secondly, more of just, an easy way for you to find the hadith. So instead of having the long hadith, for example.
Recording in progress.
So for example, if I was to narrate, how many times have I narrated Innamal A'malu Binniyat? Did I finish the whole hadith? I didn't. I just said the first 2 words and I just moved on. So that's like the thought process behind it. Just put the beginning so it's easy for you to find, and then you can focus more on the chain. So then they'll write all the chains and talk about the chains and so on. That's called Kutub al-Atraf. Then we have Kutub al-Zawaid. Kutub al-Zawaid. And Zawaid from the word ziyada, which means extra. So this would look at those ahadith which are extra from one book to another. One book, extra ahadith from one book compared to the other. So for example, if you were to look at the Zawaid of Sahih Muslim and Bukhari, then that's a book which will, those ahadith which are in Bukhari and Muslim, not them. But those extra hadith which only Muslim has narrated, gather all of them in one place. Okay, because there's some those which are exclusive to Sahih Muslim. So Zawaid, if you give the example of the extra ahadith in Sahih Muslim compared to Bukhari, those ahadith which are mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, they won't mention them. But those ahadith which are only found in Sahih Muslim and they are not found in Sahih Bukhari, they will mention that. So they will say these are the Zawaid of Sahih Muslim over Sahih Bukhari.
Like other than Sahih Bukhari.
No, it depends. It depends on Zawaid or on what. It depends on which book the author chooses. They compare the two, or three or four, depending on what, you know. I'm just telling you what Zawaid means. Okay, so it depends on which book the author has talked about. So if he chose Bukhari, comparing Muslim to Sahih Bukhari, he would do that. And if he chose comparing Bukhari to Sahih Muslim, then the same thing but the other way around. So those ahadith which are in Bukhari and not in Sahih Muslim, he will only mention them. As for those which are in both, for example, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ is in Bukhari and Muslim. So far he doesn't need to mention that. He won't mention that hadith. But for example, وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ وَعَلَيْكَ is only in Sahih Muslim. The Quran is proof for you or against you. That's only in Sahih Muslim. It's not in Bukhari. So he will mention that hadith in Zawaid. Okay, we have كتب الموضوعات. We mentioned this. What's موضوعات?
Yes.
Books of different topics, right? الموضوع means topics. Huh? Fabricated hadith. Sheikh, I mentioned to them a story of, I'll repeat for anyone who wasn't here, that there was an imam in Ta'if who after the salah, sorry, you know how the imams just read books, read Riyadh al-Salihin and give benefit. So he was reading this book, and there's another sheikh who was traveling and he was there. And he was hearing these hadith and he's thinking to himself, I've never heard these hadith before. What are these hadith? And they sound weird. A person doesn't normally speak like this. So after he went to the imam and he said, where are these hadith from? And he said, oh, it's a very beautiful book. Kitab al-Mawdu'at, the book of different topics by Ibn al-Jawzi. He said, no, Mawdu' doesn't mean topic. It means fabricated hadith. Okay? So that's important to know. Okay, then we have Kutub al-Ahkam. Now, Kutub al-Ahkam, these are very important. Ahkam is basically the rulings, most fiqh rulings. Okay, so we talked about, I mentioned to you the different topics of fiqh. So you got your worships, your ibadat, salah, zakah, and so on. Then you have your buying and selling transactions. Then you have your family law, nikah, talaq. And then you have criminal law. So these are books of hadith. They call Kutub al-Ahkam, where they gather those hadith pertaining to fiqh. Now obviously this is it's similar to Sunan. It's similar to Sunan. However, two main differences is that the Sunan were early on, very early on, 3rd century. Okay? Whereas these are later on, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, and so on. And secondly, they're a lot smaller. Okay? And there are two main books of Kutub al-Ahkam which should be studied, and I advise you to study them as well. Okay? I mention them in order. I'm going to mention two. The first is called Umdatul Ahkam. Umdatul al-Ahkam. Okay. So the other books that I mentioned, Atraf, Zawaid, and so on. I'll be honest, especially for your level, you don't need to study them. Okay, just mention them just to complete the topic that we are talking about. But Kutub al-Ahkam, especially these two, they should be studied. Okay, the first is Umdat al-Ahkam by Al-Hafiz Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi. Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi. Hafiz Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi. Okay, passed away in the year 600. Meaning he was there at the end of the 6th century. 7th century, yeah. The two reasons why we start with this. first is that every hadith in there is in Bukhari or Muslim, or both. Either in Bukhari, just in Bukhari, or just in Sahih Muslim, or in both.
It's only from Bukhari and Muslim.
Or in Bukhari. So you won't find hadith in Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, and so on. Sorry? That's the first one. That's the first one. Yeah. Also, let me answer this question. Okay, so the first is Bukhari Muslim. The second is that is very very few number of hadith, only 450, approximately 450. Approximately 450 hadiths. Obviously, comparing it to the big sunan, what, thousands? 450. So it's got the main hadith in all the 50 chapters that you need to know, and it's only 450, which means that each chapter, 2-3 hadith maybe, roundabout, maybe up to 5. Okay. And even the chapters in there, they won't mention every single chapter. Like, for example, Salah, they're not going to talk about every single issue regarding Salah, just the main ones that you need to know. So it's a good book to start off with. And because it's smaller, it'll be easier, and it's less, so you can easily finish the book. Obviously, if the book's bigger, people normally drop out and so on. The second book is Bulugh al-Maram. The second book is Bulugh al-Maram. Bulugh al-Maram. And this is about Ibn Hajar. This is about Ibn Hajar. Okay. There's another one called Ibn Hajar al-Haythami. This one is al-Asqalani. When somebody says Ibn Hajar, it's Asqalani. Al-Haythami is rarely mentioned, only if you're specializing in hadith. If you hear, not even Ibn Hajar, if you hear Al-Hafiz said Ibn Hajar. قال الحافظ it's Ibn Hajar. Okay?
What about Muttafaqun alayhi? Common hadith of Bukhari and Muslim.
Let me finish this and I'll answer that question, inshallah. So, Bulugh al-Maram is, the first benefit is that it's a little bigger. It's got about 1250 hadith. About 1250. 1250. Okay, so as you can see, it's a bit more. And in here, he mentions other ahadith which are not in Bukhari and Muslim. Because if you were to just restrict yourself to Bukhari and Muslim, then you're missing out on a lot of other fiqhi hadith. And he had his own way in referencing as well. In the introduction, he had his own way. So if he says, Rawahu al-Arba', the 4 people narrated, he would just say, the 4 people narrated, and you understand, Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abi Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, and Majah. And he explained this. Rawahu, if he says, Muttafaqun alayh, Bukhari and Muslim. Okay? Muttafaqun alayh, by the way, it has different meanings. Generally, it's Bukhari and Muslim and it's taken from Ibn Hajar from Bulugh al-Maram. That's what everyone knows. But for example, another book which is from Kutub al-Ahkam, which is a third book if you want to add it on, which is a lot bigger. It's about maybe over 2,000, about 3,000 hadith maybe. It's called Al-Muntaqa. 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 Let me just double check. Muntaqa al-Akhbar. By the grandfather of, sorry? The grandfather of Ibn Taymiyyah. No, that's good. Muntaqa al-Akhbar. In here, okay, so this is the third book that you can talk about. It's a lot more, okay? And this is studied a lot less because this is too big for people to study. In here, when he says Muttafaqun alayhi, what does he mean? He means narrated by Bukhari, Muslim, and Imam Ahmad. So he means 3. Imam al-Bayhaqi, he has another usage of Muttafaqun alayhi, but we don't have time, so I don't want to mention that, inshallah.
Are you talking about Ibn Hajar or?
This is the third book. The third one. But now, so Ibn Hajar's Bulugh al-Maram is very good. Okay, so that is the first 2 that I mentioned should be the goal to study, especially Bulugh al-Maram. However, I would always advise study Umdul al-Ahkam first, so that you have a foundation. You take in stages. If you go to the bigger book straight away, most people are going to drop out. and it might be too much to take in at one time. Okay? As for your question, there are some books that gather hadith from Bukhari and Muslim, Al-Lu'lu' Marjan and others. However, and they are studied. They are studied, but I would recommend these two books a lot more. I would recommend these two books a lot more for a number of reasons. One main reason is that you'll find the explanations of these widespread. You'll find explanations of them taught. You'll find them taught in English, taught in Arabic. You'll find written explanations. As for books like that, it's a lot less. So if you want to study it, it's very hard to find. That's something very important when you want to study a book. There's a lot of things that you have to look, a lot of different factors you have to take in. One of them is how the availability and how much khidmah, how much the scholars have helped, and this book, meaning how much they've written about it, how much they've explained, how many people in the area that you live in know that book. So, for example, there might be a book where some ulama consider it to be better than another, but nobody in your country is studying that book. Go to another book, because then you're just going to be by yourself, and you're not going to find anyone to help you, anyone to study it with, and so on. Okay, the next book, books on checking authenticity of narrators. I'll just mention one because of time. Taqrib al-Tahdhib. Taqrib al-Tahdhib. And that's by Ibn Hajar as well. Taqrib al-Tahdhib. There are some others which are bigger. We don't have time to mention all of them. But Taqrib al-Tahdhib, if you wanted to buy one, you'd buy this. And this is basically a summary of some other books. And in here are the names of narrators. And it talks about these narrators, are they authentic or not. So if you wanted to study the narrators themselves, then the smallest book is Taqrib al-Tahdhib. Okay. Books on knowing Sahaba, right? A common question is, where do I read about the lives of the Sahaba and them? I'll mention 3 books, but these are really big books. A lot of people do ask me about English, and I'm not really sure in English what books are best for Sahaba. Maybe the Sheikh can benefit. But these, in terms of the science of Hadith, the books that you go back to, the original sources, then I'll mention 3 books, inshallah. The first is Al-Isti'ab. 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 Sotaya Ain Alif Ba. Isti'ab. Okay. I'm just going to mention the main word. I'm not going to mention the whole title. That's by Ibn Abdul Barr. Ibn Abdul Barr. The second is Usdul Ghaba. Usdu al-Ghaba. Usdu al-Ghaba. That's by Ibn al-Athir. Ibn al-Athir. Usdu al-Ghaba. Ibn al-Athir. The same one you mentioned before. Al-Athir. And the third is Al-Isabah. Al-Isabah. And that's by Ibn Hajar. And if you wanted to buy one, then I would recommend the third one by Ibn Hajar. Okay, now we move on to doubts and answers on Hadith and Sunnah. The first point to mention is people rejecting Hadith is actually a prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ. Anyone remember the Hadith that we mentioned in the first day? Abu Dawood, very good. What was the Hadith? Just give me the general summary of the Hadith.
There will be some people who will accept the Quran but reject the Sunnah.
Yes. So that Hadith, the Prophet said, I've been given the Quran and something similar to it. And there will come a time when people will say, whatever you find in the book of Allah, then that's the ruling. And they won't look at the Sunnah. Okay, we mentioned this Hadith. We mentioned this Hadith in the beginning, so the reference and the whole wording of the Hadith you can find in the first day. Okay. I think it was under the authority of Hadith when we talked about the proofs from the Hadith. Might have been number 1 or number 3, something like that. Anyways, there are 2 types of Hadith rejectors. two types of hadith rejectors. The first type are those who reject hadith totally, all hadith, and these are known as Quraniyun. Quraniyun. Meaning they say we only need the Quran, we don't need the hadith. Okay? And the second are those who reject hadith partially. Meaning they reject some hadith. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Okay, so we're going to talk about the first type now, which is the Quraniyun, those who reject hadith totally. Now, those who reject hadith totally, now remember, it's very important for us to have that foundation that we studied in the beginning. Okay, so it's never recommended for a person to go into debates, doubts, these type of things if he doesn't know the basics. In fact, there was one time where it was Imam, I can't remember the Imam. It starts with a D. Now I don't know if it's Daraqutni or Zahabi or somebody else. I can't remember exactly who it is, but he had a few students, and there was one student that had traveled to come to him, and every day he was arguing and debating with other students about this issue and this issue and this issue and this issue. So then the Sheikh said, "Okay, come here." And he asked him some questions regarding istinja and regarding istijmar and things like that. And he didn't know the answer. Then he said to him, first learn the basics and then we can talk about these issues. And all the other students basically laughed. And then it was narrated that he actually got up later and packed his bags and he left. Okay? So it's very important for a person to know his foundations, the simple things. If I meet people who are debating about certain topics, they don't know the things which are obligatory upon them. How to pray, simple issues regarding aqidah, and so on. But they want to talk about the big issues. So it's very important for us to know the foundation. So when he studied the foundation on the first day, I think it was a clear cut that we have to follow a hadith. Okay? So with that foundation, now we are mentioning some doubts and some answers of these doubts. Okay? The first doubt is a hadith narrated in Daraqutni that they bring. So those who reject hadith and say we don't need hadith, just the Quran is enough, they bring one hadith. And this hadith is narrated in Daraqutni, where the Prophet ﷺ said, whatever has come to you from me, compare it to the book of Allah. So this you would write in the box, what is the doubt? So they're going to bring this hadith, yeah? He says, whatever has come to you from me, compare it to the book of Allah. And if it matches what is in the book of Allah, then I said it. And if it opposes what is in the book of Allah, then I did not say it. So if it matches what is in the book of Allah, then I said it. And if it opposes what is in the book of Allah, then I did not say it. Verily I am corresponding to the book of Allah. Verily I am corresponding to the book of Allah. And with it Allah guided me. And with it Allah guided me. Okay, so this is a doubt they bring, saying that we don't need the Sunnah. The Prophet saying himself, look at the Quran. So that means everything's in the Quran. We don't need to look at the Sunnah. Okay, we can answer this in two ways. First, this hadith is very weak. In fact, it is fabricated. The hadith is fabricated, and this is mentioned by more than one scholar of hadith. It's not just one person; it's more than one. Ibn Abdul Barr, Ibn Mahdi, Al-Bayhaqi, Ibn Abdul Barr, As-Suyuti, more than one. I'll mention one statement of Ibn Mahdi. Ibn Mahdi said, Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, he said, the heretics and the Khawarij, heretics basically, Munafiqun basically, okay? The heretics and Khawarij fabricated Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. The second point is this hadith itself contradicts the Quran. This hadith itself goes against the Quran. This hadith itself goes against the Quran. What do we take? There's ayat in the Quran which tell us to obey the Prophet. There's ayat in the Quran telling us when we differ, go back to the Prophet. There's ayat in the Quran saying that whoever follows the Prophet will get Jannah. There's ayat in the ayat saying whoever disobeys the Prophet will be in the hellfire. And so on. We mentioned all of these ayat in the first day. So this hadith itself is contradicting that is what is in the Quran. So that's the answer to the first doubt.
Can we have the third answer to that? That they are believing in the hadith to not believe in the hadith.
That's also a third one. Yeah. That can also be a third one, that they reject hadith, but they are bringing a hadith to try to prove their point. No. The second is an ayah in the Quran. The second is an ayah in the Quran. I'll give you the reference. The ayah is Surah An'am, ayah 38. So you got the reference, you can write it later, but I'll just quickly mention the ayah. The ayah is وَمَا مِن دَابَةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا طَائِرٍ يَطِيرُ في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحه إلا أمم أمثالكم ما فرطنا في الكتاب من شيء. That there is no living creature on the earth, nor a bird that flies with its two wings, but they are communities like you. We have neglected nothing in the book. We have neglected nothing in the book. So what they say is that this hadith is saying that everything is in the book. Everything, and they're saying the book here means the Quran. The book here means the Quran. So if everything is in the Quran, we don't need the hadith. If everything is in the Quran, we don't need the hadith. So
Recording in progress.
So how do we answer this? Firstly, we say that what is the correct opinion is that Al-Kitab in this ayah is not the Quran, but it's referring to Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. It's referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz. You know, the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote everything that will happen from the beginning of time to the end. And the proof for that is the context of the ayah itself. The context of the ayah is that there is no moving living creature on this earth, nor a bird that flies with its two wings, except that they are communities like you. مَا فَرَطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. Right, talking about animals and all of the different birds that fly and how many wings they have and everything. Are the details of that mentioned in the Quran? No. Okay, so that shows us that regarding their details and what will happen, everything is written in Lawh al-Mahfuz. And the second is that even with the even if we accept that it is the Quran, then has the Quran mentioned everything in terms of all the details? It hasn't. It's told us to pray Salah. Has it told us how to pray the Salah? That's the Sunnah of the Prophet. The Sunnah of the Prophet. So that's why the third point, it links with the third point, the Quran itself tells us to go to the Prophet. So everything is in the Quran. Okay, everything is in the Quran. And from those things is the Quran telling us to go to the Prophet with all those ayat that we mentioned in the first day.
The people who reject hadith, they also reject praying salah also. Because it's not mentioned.
No, generally that's something that you say to them and they stop. They're like, okay, the Prophet told us how to pray. They don't really reject salah all the time because aqim salah. The Quran says establish the prayer.
5 times.
But then exactly how many? Then they say, oh, the word 5 is not in the Quran. Yes, but we can argue even with that. Aqim salah liduluki shamsi ila ghasaqi al-layli wa Quran. The ulama say that all 5 are mentioned in this ayah. Anyways, okay, questions at the end. Yeah, any extra points at the end because I really want to finish quickly today. and we started a bit late, but we're gonna finish. Okay, the next da'at. Let me have a look. I'm not gonna mention every da'at that I have. Let me just pick one more, inshallah. Okay, we'll mention one more because it's used quite a lot. Ayah, Surah Hijr, ayah number 9. Surah Hijr, ayah number 9. Okay. The ayah is Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. Verily we have brought down the dhikr and verily we are preserving it. And they say the dhikr is the Quran. So the Quran is preserved. And that same guarantee is not for the Sunnah. So how can we trust the Sunnah? It's not preserved by Allah. Okay? The first answer is that many of the Mufassirun say that the word dhikr includes the Quran and the Sunnah. The word dhikr is not restricted to the Quran, it's Quran and Sunnah. Because the Sunnah is a revelation. We mentioned the ayah, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. The Prophet ﷺ does not speak from his own desires, but rather it is revelation. So it's a form of revelation. So Allah has preserved it as well. The second point is where next part in the ayah, inna lahu, we are preserving it. Some of Mufassirun have said it is not actually it, it's actually he. So the dhikr is the Quran and it is referring to the Prophet ﷺ. It is referring to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Some have also mentioned that. The third point is that the same people who have transmitted the Quran transmitted the Hadith, the Sahaba and Tabi'in and so on. The same people narrated Hadith.
Recording in progress.
The amount of times that's come up, right? And the fourth point is that there's a whole isnad system for us to verify and authenticate those ahadith. So we know what's authentic and we know what's not. And in fact, there's a scholar, I think he just passed away recently. His name was Al-A'zami. Al-A'zami. There's a few A'zamis. This one is called Muhammad Mustafa Al-A'zami. Muhammad Mustafa Al-A'zami passed away 5 years ago. He actually wrote a lot of books, and from them was his PhD thesis for Cambridge University in England. And he was on the Isnad system. And that was such a good book that he's defending the Isnad system and explaining it to within Cambridge, not Muslims. Yet he excelled and a lot of he really defended the Isnad system. And I'm not 100% sure, but he might have also maybe won an award for that book as well. I'm not 100% sure, he might have. Okay? So the point being is that we have the Isnad system. We have the Isnad system that none of the other religions have, and something specific to the Sunnis as well. That even those who are not Sunni, they do not have something similar in the same way that we have the Isnad system. Okay, this is enough for, I think, the Quran, and I think enough to show and to prove that we have to follow the hadith is all of those ayats. Okay, what Imam Ahmad said, 33 ayats that show that we have to follow the Sunnah. And Shaykh al-Islam said it's closer to 40 than 33. Yeah, and then all those hadith and ijma' of all of the ulama. Okay, and once there's ijma', it's not allowed permissible for a Muslim to go against that ijma'. We're gonna get to that now. Some reasons they deny the spread of the Sunnah. So what are some reasons that people deny the spread of the Sunnah? Why do they want to stop us following the Sunnah? Just quickly. Firstly, ignorance. Firstly is ignorance. They don't really understand the core principles. They don't have knowledge about Islam. They're just following the local imam or whoever they follow. So one is ignorance. The second is the result of the different ideologies. And the third is political reasons. And if you actually study the history of the Quraniyun, because this total rejection of hadith wasn't, there was partial rejection in the maybe in the first few centuries, second, third century, partial, which we're going to talk about, but complete rejection only started in the last century, especially in the subcontinent over there. And if you find many of them, it's known in the history that they worked for the British people, these people that had these they rejected the Sunnah. They worked for the British and they took money for that as well. So many a time them rejecting hadith was for a political reason. Okay, it's for a political reason. We don't have time to mention the history, but that was one of the reasons. Now we'll stick to these three, inshallah. Right, we're going to move on to the next point. Inshallah, we'll finish in the next 10 minutes. Next 10 minutes we will finish. Which is regarding Khabar Ahad. Khabar Ahad, okay, it's similar to the word Gharib. You know, Gharib we talked about in terms of Mustalah Hadith, where there's one narrator, or the minimum number in one. Even if there's many and the other, if one level has one person, it's called Gharib. Ahad is a bit more general. Gharib comes under Ahad. Ahad is basically, in simple terms, where there's not a lot of people in each chain. There's not a lot of people. And the reason I'm using the word a lot, because the ulama differ exactly on what number, which I don't want to go into, study the Mustalah Hadith. Okay? But Khabar Ahad, if you don't understand what this definition, a lot, just mainly think of it as in the lowest, in one chain, in one level of the chain, the lowest number is 1 or 2. So maybe 1, 1, 1, 1, for example. That would come under Khabar Ahad. Or there's like 3, 1, 2, something like that. Okay? That would all come under Khabar Ahad. If there was 150, 75, would that be Khabar Ahad? No, because that's a lot of people. Okay? So that's what Khabar Ahad is, in simple terms, is referring to. Now, there are some people, especially from Ahl al-Bid'ah, that they reject Khabar Ahad, when I say partially, in the science of Aqidah. In the science of Aqidah, they say we can't take Khabar Ahad. Okay? So they reject Hadith but partially. If somebody rejects Hadith totally, many ulama say that they're not Muslim. Okay? Whereas La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, that's the second part, it's not there. As for partially, then they don't consider them, generally, they don't consider them kuffar. So if you have the Ash'a'ira and Maturidi, they say they're not disbelievers, because they're not rejecting the Sunnah. They're rejecting it due to other doubts that they have. And the main doubt that they have is that they say that one person can maybe make a mistake, or so we can't accept it. Aqidah, we have to be 100% sure. Okay? But then, we can answer them with these 4 points. These are just 4 general points, not mentioning the specific doubts that they come with. There's 4 general points regarding Khabar Ahad, why we should follow Khabar Ahad. The first is Ijma' of the Salaf. Sorry? Khabar Ahad. Ijma' of the Salaf that they acted upon Khabar Ahad. Ijma' of the Salaf that they acted upon Khabar Ahad. The second is Surah At-Tawbah, ayah number 122. Surah At-Tawbah, ayah number 122. And that's the ayah that we mentioned before regarding fighting in the way of Allah. Not everybody should go and fight, but there should be there should be a small group of people that remain behind and learn about the religion so that they can teach the people the religion. Okay? So that's a small group of people. We didn't say a lot of people, we didn't say the majority. Ta'ifa, this is just a group. So that can also show, it's a proof that it's a small group of people, it doesn't affect the authenticity of something. The number does not affect the authenticity of something. The third is Hadeeth in Bukhari 3461. Hadeeth in Bukhari 3461. Well, I'll just mention the beginning of the Hadith. The Prophet said, "Ballighu anni walau ayah." Transmit from me even if it's one ayah. Okay? Now this Hadith, the Prophet said in Hajjatul Wada', in his farewell Hajj. Meaning, how many people attended the farewell Hajj of the Prophet? Anyone know? More than 100,000. Right. Did he specify that you should be a lot of people when you tell? You should tell in groups. You shouldn't be alone when you tell. No. You hear something from me, mention it to the people. Another narration, فَلِيُبَلِّغَ الشَّاهِدْ الْغَائِبِ. The one who's present, tell the person who is ghaib. So let's say today's lesson, imagine Salman, he didn't attend. Okay? So later on, you said, oh yeah, these are the notes and this is what we learned in the lesson. right? He's going to say this khabar ahad, I can't accept it. Okay, so likewise, if there's a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said this, he's going to say khabar ahad, I can't accept it. No. Okay, and then the last one, and for me, this is probably the strongest one. This last one, and this for me is the strongest one because it's the action of the Prophet ﷺ. What did the Prophet ﷺ do? When the Prophet ﷺ would send, he would send Sahaba alone to teach whole countries. He sent Mu'adh radiallahu anh to Yemen, to one side of Yemen, and Abu Musa Ash'ari to the other side of Yemen. Meaning, Mu'adh had his own people. At time of Hijrah, before he sent Mus'ab ibn Umair to teach people of Medina, right? That's khabar ahad. But now, forget narrating one hadith. He sent them to teach the people the whole religion and to be their leader. One person. Yet, the Prophet ﷺ, he sent them. And the Prophet ﷺ said, that's a proof for us that just because one person sent, it doesn't deduct from the authenticity of something. What deduct from the authenticity are other things, which are mentioned in the conditions of the hadith to be sahih, and so on. Okay, with
Sent one prophet also can be added.
you could also mention a prophet. The only issue with the prophet is that because they receive revelation and they're not, prone to especially major mistakes and so on, maybe they can answer you back with that. So it's easier to say with the Sahabi because Sahabi make mistakes. Okay, we said about the Sahaba, they're not ma'asum. Yeah, they can make mistakes here and there. Okay, but obviously we talked about their virtues and their rights and so on. Okay, and lastly, Orientalists. Now, to make this easy, I had a feeling we might not have enough time, but also to make it easy, I've written out the notes, and majority is just reading. So we can read this, inshallah. The Orientalists annotate on the following notes, meaning if I do mention anything extra, just have to add one or two words. You don't really have to write anything. Brief history. What is the actual meaning of Orientalism? And the reason I mentioned this, and this in Arabic is referred to as mustashriqun. Mustashriqun. And you know if the word alif sin ta is added at the beginning of an Arabic word, what does that mean? So you have an Arabic word. If you add alif sin ta in the beginning, talib, very good. It means you're seeking something. So ghafara means to forgive. So Allah is Ghafoor al-Ghaffar. Istighfar, seeking forgiveness. Isti'ana, seeking help, and so on. So, what's happening here? 1 second, this is okay. So mustashriqun are those who are sharq. Anyone know what sharq means? Sorry? Sharq means east. So they are seeking the east, meaning they're studying the east. Islam's well, normally in the east, right? Middle East. Okay, we're in the Middle East, right? So that's why if you read here, one second, let me get this up again. The original meaning, studying the Eastern world from Western views. So basically, in other words, these are Westerners that want to learn about the Middle East. Especially for languages and cultures, new method developed between the 13th and 16th century. So this came about in the 13th to 16th century, not Hijri.
Recording in progress.
Not Hijri, this is the Gregorian calendar. Lorenzo Vallo initially came up with this idea. Later on, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. I don't know how to say it. Erasmus. Okay, Erasmus. The first name I don't know. He further developed this. They started to investigate text manuscripts and worked with the government in the East as officers and advisors and started to study text. Type of Orientalists, archaeologists, politicians, some would focus on special fields like manners, Quran, Sirah. You can split them from their religion like Christians and Jews. What this basically means is that Orientalism is not necessarily just them focusing on Islam. It's talking about the West generally. So when you see Orientalists, they talk about cultures, Arab culture. Sometimes culture and religion sometimes can end up being two different things. Sometimes something in culture goes against Islam. So they would go into, or sometimes things in culture which are permissible, but it's not got anything to do with Islam. Okay, so they will study all these cultures from different aspects, politics or this and that and so on. So if you want to split Orientalists, you can split them from one way depending on the field that they are specializing in, or you could also split them in their religion. So you have Christian Orientalists, obviously the way they look at something is different to the Jewish Orientalists and so on. Okay, but obviously the Orientalists that we're focusing on are those who are focused on Islam. Okay, and just another point as well, when you say Orientalist, it's not 100% that every single one of them wants to attack Islam. There are some who are good, some of them actually come with some benefits that might not have been found by some Muslim scholars, some benefits here and there. But obviously the reason we want to mention them is because of many of them do want to attack Islam. Okay, some of these famous Orientalists, Alois Springer, he's one of the first. Okay, we have William Muir. You can read the small little points I mentioned regarding them. He's also quite famous. Ivan Goldziher is one of the more famous ones. Okay, he really attacked the Isnad, the Sunnah. He attacked the Isnad and Sunnah quite a lot, and especially if you skip the next one, if you go to Joseph Schacht also, he was a student, one of the main students of Goldziher. Okay, and he really developed from Goldziher and took a lot from him. As you can see here, it says he attacks Imam al-Shafi'i, a lot saying that he changed the chains to make the rulings align with his ideas. Okay, so he's basically attacking the Isnam system. He's trying to attack Imam.
Recording stopped.
What is talking
Recording in progress.
في نت ينقطع ويتصل ما أدري. لا خلاص باقي دقيقة. Okay, and then we have the last one as well, Motsky as well. He has many books on hadith. Right, these are some of the names that I mentioned. I've not really brought some of the doubts because we have actually, by us studying the foundations, we can answer a lot of the doubts. For example, one doubt you guys can answer: hadith writing only began by Imam al-Zuhri. Okay, because Ibn Hajar and Imam al-Suyuti said the first one to compile hadith was Imam al-Zuhri. And your answer to that is? That's official. Was the writing before? Scrolls of Sahaba, scrolls of the Tabi'een, and so on. Okay, so many of the doubts that we have that they bring, we've answered them. So that's why I've not really made a separate thing to answer them. We've taken them. I've not mentioned that this is a doubt, but we've taken them. Okay, and they also, because they also, and this is the last point, inshallah, they don't obviously, especially if they want to attack Islam, they don't want to agree with everything in Islam. So they have their own way of authenticating hadith as well. So they have their own system they've made as well. And you can read some of these. Some people have their own. For example, the last one, Motsky, the second line, he developed his own isnad measuring system. And he proves that a lot of the hadith are authentic according to his own system. So he made his own system, but then even according to his own system, a lot of them were authentic as well. Okay? And because they are researchers, sometimes, many a time, they try to show that they're fair. And sometimes they are fair. So that's why he ended up with being authentic. But many a time, they are unfair in the sense that they don't bring the whole information and they bring doubts. For example, we have William Muir. William Muir, for example, the second, he was attacking Imam al-Zuhri. And he said Imam al-Zuhri, during his life, he worked for the Amir. So that shows he was politically affected, and he lied about a hadith and so on. Okay? And even that in of itself is not fully true. What's funny is that William Muir, he himself was British, working for the British in India. So he was working for them himself. So that's the same thing can be said for him. So you can see a lot of these times that they're not really fair. So that's why it's very important that a person doesn't believe everything he says. Just a last point, quickly we'll read it. Main difference is how hadith is criticized. Main difference is how they look at hadith and how we look at hadith. The first, Muslims base it on aqidah. The foundation of the religion according to us is what? Our aqidah. Orientalists base it on natural law and philosophy. They base it on philosophy and they have all these questions, and you probably heard of people that when they go into philosophy so much, they come to the conclusion, I don't even know if I'm real, if I'm alive or not. No, that's how. That's what philosophy takes you to, you know. And even some of the Muslims, scholars who delved into philosophy, you'll find that at the end of their life, you know, either they're regretting going into it. You know, for Ahlul Bid'ah, we have some Ash'ari, because when they go into Aqidah, they go into Ilm al-Kalam and that bit of philosophy as well and so on. At the end of their life, they're regretting, or they're confused. At the end, they're like, we don't know. They just get confused. So it's very, you know, dangerous. Number two, Muslims have a systematic procedure to accept and reject hadith for any time or place. It can be used even now. Orientalists, however, are skeptics. Every hadith is fabricated until they can prove it. Okay, so we have a proper system. They don't have a proper system. They just have, you know, because they come with the mindset that they want to attack Islam, they're not fair. At the last, Muslims criticize the chain and text, and we know every person in the chain. Orientalists mainly criticize the text, but they don't understand the chain enough to criticize it. Yeah, so their knowledge of the actual chain, because if you actually want to go into the chain, it's very difficult. Especially when you go into science of ilm, the hidden mistakes in the chain. These are only like Imam Ahmad, memorizing many hadith. Even people specialized in hadith now can't, from Muslim scholars who have spent decades studying, they, you know, you don't even get to that level to specialize in the science of ilm, for example. So, so with that, alhamdulillah, we finished. And one of the reasons I mentioned Orientalism, the reason I really wanted to mention it, is because many Muslims are very unaware of that. Many of the universities, especially in the West, Orientalists are teaching about Islam, and they mention these doubts and so on. And many Muslims are being, you know, we may not see it, sometimes we're in a bubble, but many Muslims are afflicted with these doubts. They're afflicted with doubts of following the Sunnah, doubts, is hadith actually authentic or not, you know, it wasn't really written at the time, and so on. So it's very important to know these things. And with this, alhamdulillah, we've come to the conclusion of this hadith dawrah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it mean the benefit and to accept it from us. Tomorrow we have the Usul al-Fiqh dawrah. Inshallah, starting at
4 p.m.
4 p.m. till
Until
9:30, not 10:30, 9:30. Well, not even 10:50. Okay.
tomorrow I like to call 2 days, huh?
It's 2 days, Saturday, Friday and Saturday. Also, remember we said there's going to be an exam on this, on the Hadith Dawrah. The exam, inshallah, will be sometime next week. Maybe next weekend. Okay, so that gives you some time to revise. And it's also on the weekend, so you're a bit more free to revise, inshallah. And most likely it'll be like on Google Forms, something online, and it will be sent out. If you're not on the thing, what is it, a WhatsApp group?
Contact us to get into that.
If you don't have the contacts, just take the contact details, inshallah. Okay, we'll stop here, inshallah.
Those are registered. I mean, you know that for all the 5 days we have the attendance. We need to do the attendance there. So it's QR code. Stick on this board and also outside. Please fill it.